Open up your Bibles to Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5. I'll get myself over there as well. I want us to focus in. The reading today for Pew Packers was verses 21 to the end of the chapter, verse 43. But I want us to focus in on the second miracle that occurs in this passage. There's two. The one with Jairus' daughter, the synagogue official. And then there was a little interruption right there in the middle while they were on their way to go see to his daughter. You have this woman here. She was very poor. She's troubled. She's seriously ill. She's been wrestling with this terrible sickness for 12 years. Now, we may sometimes think that, we've had people this day and age are dealing with sicknesses for many, many years. But could you imagine dealing with a sickness where you cannot stop this illness of her bleeding for 12 years, but there is no, medical system to really look to. And since this is an issue that has to do with blood, she's considered unclean. No one wants to be around her, so she's kind of an outcast. She spends all her money on these physicians to help her. They could not help improve her health. In fact, it got worse. And so having lived for years in this hopelessness, being an outcast, being unclean, she looks to Jesus as her last resort. Reports of him, preaching, healing, had been circulating all throughout the city. Surely she's heard and she's embraced these things she's been hearing about him. Maybe she's seen Jesus do some miracles, perhaps, but chances are she heard some testimony about him. Driven by a desperation, she is determined to get herself over there to him. Now, this episode is full of compassion. We see a lot of things about this, but what this woman did answers some questions for us, I think. Like we hear, or we talk a lot about faith. And having maybe we use the term working faith or a living faith, an active faith. And have you ever stopped to think, well, how does a person, or how do I come to that? We talk about the obedient faith or that active faith, and are there these different levels or stages of faith? And there are, and we actually see the three main stages of that right here with this woman. And so the first stage that we see in her faith journey is this acceptance of the words, the testimony that she's received about Jesus. So faith comes by hearing, hearing by what? The Word of God, or the Word of Christ, New American Standard. In this case, she heard legitimate reports about the things that Jesus had been doing. Her acceptance of that testimony, it had reached her ear. It challenged her heart. It got her thinking. And so she's probably thinking, if this is true, maybe this is the Jesus that we've been waiting for or looking for. Whatever her understanding was, I'm sure it was probably vague, like it was for many that day and age. But it was strong enough to motivate her to take action. It makes me, whenever I read this, I think about Rahab over in the book of Joshua, chapter 2. Remember, she heard, how many stories did she hear about Israel and what happened with them down in Egypt? How many stories did she hear? 2. She heard 2 stories about them, about what they had done to Egypt and how they crossed over the sea. So she read about, look those up, Joshua chapter 2. The fight with the armies when they crossed the sea. Yeah, so she heard that story about the crossing the sea. And so she accepted that as a valid beginning. Now, if that had been me, think about it, if you were there and you heard those stories, would you just think, those are just, they built those stories up to sound that way. But she accepted the stories, and she acted on that. And here we have this woman. She hears the stories about Jesus. She's coming from, and so she's accepted the things she heard about Jesus. And then that brings her to her second stage, assertion. It's what she decided to do about that, accepting the testimony she heard. When she learned that Jesus was nearby, she determined to make her way through the crowd. If you read through the chapters, you know that the people are crowded around him, they're pushing up against him. And even when Jesus says, "Who touched me?" What did the disciples say? There's everyone around you. Everyone's touching you, and you're asking who touched you. So a lot's happening. And imagine her situation. She's got to try to get through all these people to Jesus. So she's having to push her way up there. And she's thinking if she could just get up there, touch his robe, that would work. Jesus tells us in verse 28, "For she thought, if I just touched his garments, I will get well." Literally it says, "For she said," as if she was probably saying this to somebody, maybe going over what she was thinking. If I can get to Jesus, I think if all I could do just touch him, I'll be made well. Or literally, I will be saved from the affliction that she has. So that's what she's got in her mind. She believes that can happen. So it's one thing to know Jesus was near, but a whole other thing to try to plow through this crowd, get close enough so that she could touch his robe. So acceptance was that first stage. But that stage had to be followed by the assertion. If her factual faith was to manifest itself as actual faith. During the wilderness wanderings of the Israelites, remember the fiery serpents? When they were, again, grumbling and complaining, and God sent those serpents that they bit and they were probably felt like fire. And then what did God tell Moses to do? I wouldn't ask my pew practice. Make a bronze snake and lift it up. Anyone bit would look upon that bronze snake, right? And then they would be healed. That's over there in Numbers chapter 21. So simply becoming aware, though, of the remedy would not bring healing to a person dying. Each sufferer would have to accept the testimony they received of what to do and then act on that acceptance by following the directions for healing, looking to the bronze snake. So you have those two things, the acceptance and the assertion. And then that brings us to the third stage for this woman. That is the action stage. She had decided she was going to touch Jesus, but her faith would have to become a living faith. She would have to make her way there to where Jesus is at. Had she just stood there maybe and just watched Jesus pass, that wasn't going to do it. She had to have, if she wanted to be healed, she needed to act. She made her way around the people ahead of her. She reached out and she touched him. In James chapter 2, he emphasizes the works of faith, right? Faith without works is dead. That's right. He's pretty much saying that faith is not actual faith unless there's some work that's going on behind it. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. That's chapter 2, verse 24. That's the difference between a factual and actual faith. Factual faith is simply acceptance and assertion. That is something we see a lot of. Most people in this world have an acceptance of who Jesus is in his testimony, and it asserts them to do something. And for most of them, that assertion is simply, well, I heard about Jesus, I believe in Jesus, so I'm going to go to worship services, and I'm going to sit on Sundays and on Wednesdays, and then I'm going to go home. And that is the extent. That's it. That's all there ever is to their faith. It never actually reaches them to the point of where they have action, and they're actually doing something and acting on that faith within their life. So I think that's where most people are. They're in those first two stages, but they never move beyond that. Actual faith can likewise cause us to tremble, but it also moves us beyond that to action, as with this woman who touched the robe of Jesus. Actual faith is the action that the acceptance, the assertion of the testimony produced. That was true of her faith, and it is true of our faith. Mark tells us at the completion of this journey that she has, in verse 30, immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And of course, as we just pointed out earlier, the disciples were like, "What do you mean, who touched?" Everyone's touching you. What are you talking about? But if you notice in there, he ignores them. He completely ignores them. And in verse 33, it says, not verse 33, 32. Jesus looked around to see the woman who had done this. So it's like he turns around and he says, "Who touched me?" And his disciples are talking, and as he says that, he didn't even say anything. He just looks right at her. Have you ever had that happen to you with your parents? Who did this? Who did this? And the kids know, right? And so she probably had that feeling. He's looking right at her, and she feels bad. So she falls down, and she tells the whole truth. And that's when he says to her in verse 34, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." How many times have you read that in different passages and wondered how the miracle made them well? Jesus made them well. How did her faith make her well? Well, that's it. Her faith, she heard something about Jesus. It caused her to assert herself. And then beyond that, it caused her to go to some action in that. And that's why the faith healed her. You remember we talked about that story where those men dug a hole in the ceiling and they lowered the paralytic? And who does Jesus look to and say, and whose faith made him well? Action. They heard. It caused them to assert themselves, and it caused them to action. So they heard, they came, they couldn't get to Jesus. What do? Whatever it took to get to Jesus. Like the man who stumbled across the valuable treasure, and he buried it and went and sold everything he had, whatever it took to get it. That's the kind of faith he's looking for. Not the faith where, hey, I hear something about Jesus and I believe it. Or I hear something about Jesus that really drives me to want to actually go to church. It's so much more. It needs to drive us to action. How far are we willing to go for him? Whatever it takes. It's hard for us to imagine how that it would have been difficult for this woman to do what she did. She's extremely ill. 12 years. She's considered unclean. She can't be there where she's at. And she's going to touch this man who she probably thinks is the Messiah. She's unclean. I could get her stoned and killed. And she's touching everybody around there because there's so many people around her. But she did it. It was faith. What are we willing to do? Actual faith always brings us to Jesus because of its genuineness, and it enables us to enjoy, because of that, it enables us to enjoy all the benefits and blessings of being with him. Many times, as we've been talking quite a bit about this over the past, a couple of months at the beginning of this year, a lot of people in the world believe they have faith, and they do have faith to a point. It's never reached fruition. It's never matured or sprouted. It's like that seed fell in certain places, but it never quite on that deep soil where it's going to get root. They heard something about Jesus, but they haven't quite moved beyond that assertion. They haven't gone to action yet. They're usually because they don't believe everything they hear about Jesus, whether that be baptism or whatever it might be, but they're struggling in many ways. And I think that's what these stories are here for people like that, who've come part way, but not quite all the way. And so this one, the story of the paralytic, are stories that you and I can use in those doors of opportunity to help people see who Jesus really is, to see where they're at and where they need to be. And that's a story I would use right here in the story of the paralytic, of being lowered down from above, to show what faith, genuine faith, really looks like. It's kind of a sermon. I didn't quite throw questions out there. Any comments or questions? I felt like I was tight on time, so that's why I did that. Okay. Well, I really like that passage. I should have given myself more time for discussion. But think about that. I think if you look at this story, think about those 3 stages of faith, and look at that story with the paralytic being lowered down, you'll see that. And it'll help us understand why Jesus says, your faith made you well. Your faith made him well because of what that means. We hear something about Jesus. It causes us to assert ourselves, to see him, and then it causes us to action because of him. It's all centered around Jesus. Let's sing number 382.